All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Regent College and to our 13th evening public lecture of this very different summer of 2020. My name is Christina Louie, and I am the Alumni and Church Involvement Officer at Regent College. And on behalf of the entire Regent community, I'm happy to extend you a warm welcome to tonight's lecture. Now, before we begin, I just want to ask you to do one thing if you haven't already done this, and that's to navigate on your phone to rgnt.net/subscribe. That's rgnt.net/subscribe. And this will take you to our email subscription form. And the reason I'm inviting you to do that is because we've got lots of great free lectures this summer, as well as plenty of other resources. And so we would invite you to sign up and stay informed about all of the great things that are happening at Regent College. Now, just to give you a bit of a sense of how we're going to have this lecture this evening, I'll just run over the format. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Cindy Aalders as our lecturer tonight, and she will talk for about 50 minutes. And then after that, we will have a question and answer period that will sort of run from 15 to 25 minutes, depending on the questions that come in. Now, since you're our live audience, for the live audience, you can email questions to me at eplquestions@regent-college.edu. Again, that's eplquestions@regent-college.edu, and is also listed in the description below this video. So feel free to send those questions through during the lecture and just after, as Cindy and I engage in the conversation time. And then our evening will end promptly at 9 p.m. Pacific time at the latest. So, with those formalities aside, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Cindy Aalders. Cindy is the director of the John Richard Allison Library, and she is assistant professor of the history of Christianity at Regent College. She completed her doctoral work at the University of Oxford, where her research focused on the spiritual lives and manuscript cultures of 18th century British women. Her thesis is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. And in addition to numerous journal articles and book chapters, she is the author of To Express the Ineffable, The Hymns and Spirituality of Anne Steele. Cindy's current research explores the religious lives of 18th century children. And with that, I hand it over to Dr. Cindy Aalders.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that kind welcome. We are living in a strange and difficult time. The COVID-19 pandemic is having an effect on all of us, whether or not we or those we love ever contract the virus. The effects are small and large. Almost every way in which we engage the world is now entwined, entangled with the reality of COVID-19. For instance, I am giving this lecture from my apartment rather than the Regent Chapel, which hasn't been used in months. As Regent faculty, staff, students, and friends, many of us ache to be face to face with each other again. Many of us also long to return to church, where we can engage in the physical manifestations of worship, whether kneeling to pray or standing to sing. We hunger to take communion again. And now the virus has become politicized with devastating results. The poorest and most frail amongst us are the most likely to fall ill. Financial anxiety is high for some as the economy brings down with it many businesses and jobs. The social impact of COVID-19 is still revealing itself, but includes a rise in domestic violence. The UN recently stated that cases of domestic abuse have increased more than 20% during the pandemic. For some, the stay-at-home order does not locate them in a place of safety. The impact of the virus on mental health is also serious, with many referring to the surge in mental health crises as a second pandemic. Others warn that we could also be facing a suicide pandemic. Around the world, restrictions have been placed on who is permitted to be physically present to another. Two of the terms used frequently in directives from public health officers and politicians are family and household. This interests me greatly. Since March, the BC Centre for Disease Control has stated that we should all take care to keep a 6-foot distance from those outside our household, typically imagined by the CDC and news cycles as a nuclear family. I've seen many images on social media that show families enjoying this newfound time together, which is a beautiful thing in our typically too fast-paced world. Now, I know that a social media presence is a curated presence. That is, there is an act of selecting and presenting oneself to a social media audience. And I know such photos don't reveal the more complex reality of a family in isolation. I found myself looking for, but not finding, images of other experiences of isolation. More recently, tight controls have loosened somewhat, so that two families or households are permitted to make up larger groups of people with whom they can safely be in contact, doubled bubbles, as it were. We also hear in the news the regrettable stories of families separated from each other by closed borders. Just last week, a CBC story reported that certain exemptions were being introduced that would allow immediate family members, such as spouses, parents, and children, to reunite. Eventually, this exemption may expand to include extended family members, like grandparents. There does not yet seem to be consideration for more so-called distant kin, including aunts, uncles, and cousins. I am as pleased as anyone to hear about people being reunited after a lengthy absence. But what I find interesting is the implicit hierarchy of relationships that inform legal exemptions. So my question these past few months has been, for whom does this not work? This opening up of possibilities for physical love and belonging that are based on household and family. Who remains isolated? I fear there are many. And now I think it's fair to tell you a little bit about where I am coming from personally. I am a single woman and I live alone. Or rather, I live with one small cat named Abby. And just to warn you, she finds Zoom something of a magnet, so you may meet her this evening. When public health officers began to talk about doubling our bubbles, I looked around and thought, well, I have one cat in my bubble, I guess I can get another. I haven't. I live in a modest apartment here in Vancouver, and oftentimes the walls seem very close. I am enormously grateful that it is summer and I'm able to spend time outdoors, and even more grateful that I can meet with friends outside, appropriately distanced, of course. But I'm already a little worried about cooler weather settling in and making safe, permissible social contact more difficult. This is only a glimpse into my own experience of living in our COVID-19 world. I have dear friends who are experiencing this differently and far more painfully for reasons that have to do with the way we understand family and household today. So tonight I'd like to think with you about these two terms, family and household, particularly as they are understood to be the locus of love and belonging. And I'd like to do this with three movements. Our present circumstances, as I've already begun to describe, followed by a more lengthy exploration of the shape of family in history. And finally, I'll conclude with a few thoughts regarding new possibilities for love and belonging, family and household, as we move together into our uncertain future. I think there is no denying that in evangelical culture and North American culture more broadly, marriage and the family are seen as primary relationships. Most young people expect to get married. For many young women in particular, marriage is the prize to go after. There are far too many stories of young women who, quote, fail to marry, who go on to experience spiritual crises. A recent article in Relevant magazine reported that studies in the UK and in the US showed that single women are the most likely group to leave Christianity. I wish I could say I was surprised when I read this, but I remember being in my mid-20s as many of my Christian friends got married in church, while at about the same rate, my single women friends left. Why do they leave? One of the reasons is that marriage can afford women a certain visibility, even authority in the church. For married women, children and husbands can create space for them in church. Single women are leaving church because they perceive there is no space for them. Often they feel invisible, isolated. The church can be for them a place of great loneliness. If marriage and family are primary relationships, friendship is generally considered secondary. Now, I've been fortunate in friendship. I have a few deep friendships in which I experienced the gift of real intimacy. But I always am aware, however much I may want to suppress such thoughts, that there is contingency in these friendships, since nothing formal secures our bonds. And here, let me recommend to you Wesley Hill's excellent little book, Spiritual Friendship, for his exploration of how historical Christians did enter formal bonds of friendship by taking vows that sound like marriage vows today. For myself, I want friendship to be solid and substantial, but I understand there are forces working against my understanding it that way today. Friendship is not valued or recognized in the way that Christian fellowship requires. Sanctification is so often associated with marriage and parenthood. Here is where we learn to sacrifice. Here I begin to understand the love of God. But singleness can also sanctify. In it, we must learn to trust God in particular ways, because community, love, relationship, social and financial security, the next generation, all of these good things are not available to those who are single in the way our culture teaches us to expect them. Singleness reminds us that our first identity is as a person in Christ. A particularly beautiful thing about Jesus is that his life is a testament to the fact that being single does not have to equate to loneliness, nor does it exclude enjoying deep levels of intimacy. Jesus, just like us, lived within the relational fabric of community in order to sustain his full humanity. There is so much for us to continue to learn from Jesus. Yet loneliness is a serious issue in Western cultures. Research done recently at Harvard concluded that loneliness is increasingly being considered a hazard to human health comparable to obesity and smoking. Regarding this research, the former Surgeon General of the US wrote, "Loneliness and weak social connections are associated with a reduction in lifespan similar to that caused by smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity." In 2018, the UK government appointed a minister for loneliness to help combat the country's chronic loneliness problem. In the US, loneliness is labeled an epidemic worthy of a public health intervention, but there hasn't been any major government action yet. While it isn't a straightforward process to measure loneliness, researchers use several kinds of data to determine whether a person is lonely or not. Aspects of someone's life, like marital status, size of household, and size of social network, all have a hand in establishing who is more likely to identify as lonely. Researchers also investigate less measurable variables like perception of loneliness, perceived support, and satisfaction in relationships. COVID-19 has now collided with these significant challenges to spiritual, social, and mental well-being, intensifying these pre-existing realities for so many. COVID-19 shines a spotlight on deep needs within our communities, if we will just attend to what the light illuminates. How will the church respond? How will we respond? I want to suggest that perhaps we could alleviate some of these needs, this suffering and isolation, if we reconsidered the shape of family itself. And I want to do this by turning to history, Part of what I love about the study of history is that it has the potential to problematize what we consider intrinsically good and right in our own time. How do we respond when what we assume is proper Christian praxis was performed differently by past Christians? This is an important and I think really interesting question. So before we go forward further, let me just take a moment to share my screen with you to show you some slides. Oops. Oops, sorry. That's not right. Share. Here we go. Okay. So tonight I'd like to think with you about the shape of family in history and to ask some questions about love and belonging in the 18th century, which is where I tend to spend my time when I'm not here in the 21st century with all of you. The 18th century provides a helpful window into our exploration of the shape of past families because historians' understanding of family and household in the period has been contested and thus the subject of significant inquiry. Beginning in the 1960s, scholars shifted their understanding of 18th century family from multi-generational households to the nuclear family. In the 1970s, historian Alan McFarlane proposed the onion model, seen here. So this model presents the family system in the form of layers or concentric circles, like an onion's skins. At the center of the model is ego, the individual from whose point of view the kinship ties are traced. Around him, in a series of circles, are his kin. The nuclear family, including father, mother, son, daughter, occupies the first circle. Grandparents and grandchildren occupy the next layer. Aunts, uncles, nephews, and nieces occupy the third circle, and beyond them are the cousins. The well-focused nucleus fades into fuzzy margins with some points of gradation along the way. Insofar as current scholarly accounts of the 18th century kinship system imply that kinship terms were used in similar ways in the past and now, and that they're related to each other in similar ways in the past and now, they are, I suggest, misleading. More recent research, including my own, has broadened this view, asking questions about the extent of nominal and fictive kinship, the meaning of family and kinship alongside other relationships, and the size and shape of co-residential groups. This research does not agree well with such categorical definitions of the nuclear family and the extended family, nor does it conform to the onion model. What concepts of the family did people have in the 18th century? Did they focus exclusively on the nuclear unit as the prototype of household and family relationships, or were other concepts of the family significant in their worldview? This is a far more complex question than we might assume. But if we attend to the language people used, it seems that the latter was the case. Very often when 18th century English people spoke or wrote about families, it was not the nuclear unit that they had in mind. In recent years, historians have shown that families were often deeply enmeshed in networks of fictive kinship. That is, people related to families through contract, acquaintance, friendship, or work, some of whom were co-resident and some more distantly resident. Fictive kinship was at least as important for the meaning of family and kinship as relations of blood, marriage, and law. As well, terms such as friend, lodger, visitor, servant, pupil, assistant, and apprentice might actually mask a blood or marriage relationship between one or more family members. And at the same time, there existed slippage in relational terminology so that seemingly concrete labels such as daughter, mother, or aunt might in fact denote fictive kinship. How did this affect a person's sense of love and belonging? If people in 18th century England could understand relations with non-kin in familial terms, and if within families, kin and non-kin could be contractually bound, yet if at the same time notions of lineage were also valued, how, in view of all of this, did people perceive relations with kin? And how can their language help us to probe further concepts of family and kinship current in 18th century England? So, starting with our main keyword so far, we can see that the word family was also used in the 18th century to refer to circles of kin both within and beyond households. To present-day English speakers, this concept of the kinship family seems obvious. This is the main usage of the word today, and English speakers have no difficulty in identifying it when it also appears in texts from the past. For instance, when present-day readers find that in 1732, Anne Cater Steele wrote in her diary of her hopes that others might receive soul benefit by coming into our family, they can understand that this early Baptist matriarch referred to her near kin, members of her nuclear family of origin. The correspondence between some 18th century and present-day references to the kinship family may lead us to think that the kinship concept of the family was largely the same then as now. This conclusion would be justified if it were not for two additional complications. First, usages could shade into each other, and even apparently obvious usages could be less transparent than they appear at first sight. Second, alongside the apparently transparent usages, many references to kin are not at all self-evident and clearly require a historical explanation. Such, for example, are the usages of kinship terms current in the 18th century, such as relations, connections, or even friends. Terms such as kinsman and cousin also had significant usages that tell us much about perceptions of kinship in 18th century society and culture. Such terms were used to recognize a variety of kin, including the nuclear family members. Not only was the nuclear family not isolated by these usages, but they actually served to submerge the nuclear family in broader kinship relationships. This kinship terminology was not marked by the precision assumed in the onion model, nor was it marked by careful gradation. This was a terminology of inclusiveness and recognition that was used broadly in the 18th century. And indeed, as we will see, even apparently self-evident terms such as brother, son, or mother had a range of historical meanings, as well as conventional usages that require observation and elucidation. Tonight, I'd like to conceptualize practices of the 18th century language of family and household. And I'll do this via two case studies drawn from my own research, the Steele family and the Talbot family. So let us trace some of these themes in the Steele family. By way of context, for generations, the Steele family and their nearest relations lived in a small cluster of villages in rural Hampshire, where they were leading members of a number of small Baptist churches. William Steele was a timber merchant and pastor of the local Baptist church. He married twice, as you see, and I feel I should warn you now that a lot of people in the 18th century were named Anne and William. William and his first wife, Anne Froude, had two children named predictably William and Anne. Anne Froude died young in childbirth, and a few years later, William married another Anne, Anne Cater. Together, they had a daughter, Mary. In some ways, these five formed the family circle, or at least this is a good place to begin. Anne Cater Steele cared for the three children in the family home. called grandfathers then, and, so England goes, still known as grandfathers today. While William Steele the elder served as pastor of the local Baptist church, Ann Cater Steele served alongside him as an unofficial pastor. She provided religious advice and guidance to those who wished to join the Baptist church. Ann Cater Steele kept an extraordinary diary, seen here, which can result in an extraordinary headache if you try to read it for too long in one sitting. Punctuation was apparently optional in the 18th century, and at least in this diary, there was no allowance given for white space. In amongst more personal entries, the diary shows that Ann Cater Steele was particularly attentive to issues of church membership. Indeed, her diary mirrors official church books, noting baptisms, deaths, and transfers from other churches, though it supplements their unembellished census by incorporating greater detail, personal commentary, and religious interpretation. As one example, the official church books for 1732 showed an unusual influx of members. Ann Cater Steele described this as a season of local revival. Her diary clarifies that most of those baptized in 1732 were children or servants of current members. Ann Cater Steele had a special concern for the conversion of younger members of her community and family, and it was she who wrote of her hope that nieces and nephews might receive soul benefit by coming into our family. She clearly developed a reputation within her extended family for facilitating conversion, for her diary shows that nieces and nephews frequently traveled to her home in Broughton to talk with her. The autumn of 1732 brought concurrent visits from nieces from three branches of the family. Molly Cottle from Trowbridge, Wiltshire, Nanny Froud from East Knoll, Wiltshire, and Anna Gray from Haycombe, near Bath in Somerset. They all stayed at grandfather's for extended periods, becoming part of the household in Broughton. The same year, she talked with local kin Sarah and Clements Etheridge as they moved toward baptism. When separated from nieces and nephews, she initiated correspondences, hoping to encourage religious seriousness through the post. In June 1732, she wrote in her diary, "My desires run out for the good of my sister's children's souls, and having writ to some, I received a letter from my second niece." Ann Cater Steele felt a particular burden of care for her nieces and nephews and played a critical role in their religious training. But whatever their biological relationship, Ann Cater Steele looked upon the young people she guided towards baptism as her children. After talking with her niece, Elizabeth Gay, she wrote in her diary, "I was drawn out to cry to the Lord, not only on her account, but for all the dear children belonging to me, that Christ may be formed in all their souls." Elizabeth was my sister's child, but as Ann Cater Steele guided her toward her new birth at conversion, she also became her aunt's spiritual child. This understanding of family extended beyond familial ties, for when one of her servants expressed an increased religious seriousness, she talked with him as well, afterward writing in her diary, "I was engaged to thankfulness and said, 'The Lord shall add to me another son.'" Ann Cater Steele's spiritual interest in particular individuals defied familial bonds. Aunt or employer, she was also their mother. It is sometimes difficult to untangle relationships in Ann Cater Steele's diary, for as mentioned, relational terminology was flexible in the period. Thus, she often used the generic term cousin to refer to nieces or nephews. The term cousin has been used for centuries very widely. At the nearest, it was applied to the sons and daughters of siblings. However, cousin could also apply to the sons and daughters of aunts and uncles, as in the present day sense, and it could be used more broadly in recognition of more distant kin. Sometimes it seems that this term was simply used simply to indicate that a kinship claim existed, rather than to recognize any specific kinship term or the application of specific kinship degree. In other cases, nephew could be used to mean grandson. The usage of friend was a kinship term, or the application of elementary relational terms was given to affines, an affine being a relationship made by marriage. So, for instance, naming a sister-in-law as sister. Anne Cater Steele used familial terms so flexibly that not only were her children and the children of her sisters referred to as her sons and daughters, but so too were the family's servants. Significant inclusion and lack of differentiation could be manifested also in historical usages of the nuclear family terms. I love discovering this evidence of the capacious human heart over and over again in my study of history. The human heart is large enough to contain more than those relationships our culture tells us are primary, of ultimate significance, the nuclear family. I find this wonderfully hopeful. In the Steele family, such care for younger kin persisted into the next generation. I hope this family tree is beginning to feel familiar. Right now, I'd like to focus on this corner of the slide. Anne Cater Steele's stepdaughter, the poet and hymn writer Anne Steele, seen here at the right-hand side of the oval, never married, yet she became to her niece Mary a second mother. Mary's biological mother, Mary Bullock Steele, died when Mary was just 9 years old, and from that time, Anne Steele stepped in to care for her. In time, changing households when she moved into her brother's house to be with Mary. Mary would later memorialize her aunt as a maternal friend and as my friend, my second parent. Here is an example of the plurality that sometimes characterized relationships, for it was possible to refer to the same relationship with the use of more than one kinship term. Anne Steele was friend and mother, while also being Mary's aunt. From a theoretical point of view, the existence of plurality makes it even more difficult to fit the language of kinship current in the 18th century into the onion model. Steele wrote much affectionate and instructive poetry for her niece, and as Mary grew up, she began to respond in verse addressed to her aunt. Mary was a sensitive girl, and in response to her continuing sorrow over the loss of her mother, Anne Steele used poems to teach her to trust in the love of God. She wanted her niece to know that during affliction's darkest hours, she could trust that a providential God remained profusely kind, caring for her in her loss and fear. She wrote to encourage her niece, urging her to live in hope, and passed on to her lessons she had learned through her own experiences of illness and loss. Addressing Mary by her familial pseudonym Sylvia, she wrote, "And see, my Sylvia, see that friend appear, and hark, he calls you to his guardian arms, Jesus, that friend indeed, forever near, when grief approaches or when death alarms." In verse, Steele encouraged her niece to contemplate Jesus as near and loving, even in the midst of her grief and doubt. Anne Steele loved Mary and expressed ongoing interest in her physical, literary, and spiritual life. Mary, for her part, was conscious of her religious heritage in the Baptist Church and of her advantages in the religious instruction she received from her aunt. Yet she was troubled by the Calvinistic doctrine of election, and so was unable to align herself fully with her family's faith. Questions and anxiety were not resolved before her aunt's death in 1778, and Anne Steele's desire to ease Mary's troubled spirit and to resolve her spiritual impasse led her to enlist Caleb Evans, her friend and founder of the Bristol Education Society, to take up the task she could no longer perform by encouraging and instructing Mary via letter. and Steele took special care to provide for Mary a spiritual father when her death meant she could no longer be there with and for her. As demonstrated in the Steele family, these extended nuclear usages were indeed so common in 18th century England because, contrary to any simplistic anthropological account, the language of kinship was used not only to describe relationships by blood and marriage, but also to signify social relationships and moral duties. The filial relationship, the parental relationship, the sibling relationship, the avuncular relationship, and even cousinage, all these were potential bonds, as well as possible descriptions of biological connections. The recognition of these relationships by naming, therefore, was an announcement of status and a possible undertaking of obligations. Solidarity, consideration, duty, and support could be expected, even if not given. From the point of view of textual meaning, however, the result of these extended nuclear usages is that it is sometimes difficult for the present-day reader to know the identity of the individual referred to by a kinship term. And I have certainly puzzled over this in my archival work on lesser-known subjects whose family trees have yet to be worked out. But I've been delighted with the challenges. The study of history as detective work, as excavation, is another thing I love about it. For a very different experience of family and household, I want to turn now from the Steeles to consider the Talbot family. And already you might notice a significant difference. While it is possible to draw a large and complicated Steele family tree, and I have done it, the Talbot tree is strikingly abbreviated. And while Catherine Talbot was not born here, she did spend the latter part of her life living at Lambeth Palace in London. The palace's current resident, as you might know, is Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Edward Talbot, who was a clergyman and Archdeacon of Berkshire, died of smallpox 5 months before Catherine Talbot was born in 1721. She thus turned to a more complex configuration of parental figures for moral and religious guidance. Her most constant parental presence was her mother, Mary Talbot, with whom she lived all her life. But letters and diaries reveal other significant parental relationships. When her husband died, the pregnant Mary Talbot was gathered into the household of Catherine Benson, who you'll find near the top left corner of this diagram. Catherine Talbot was born in Benson's household and named for her mother's dear friend. A few years later, Thomas Secker, who would go on to become Archbishop of Canterbury, asked Benson to marry him. She agreed only on the condition that Mary and Catherine Talbot would join their household. And indeed, there they remained until Secker's death almost 50 years later. Edward Talbot had been close friends with other leading Anglican clergymen, Martin Benson, Joseph Butler, Thomas Rundle, and George Berkeley. And after his death, they and Thomas Secker rallied to care for the fatherless girl. Duty to her father blended with affection for Catherine Talbot. When she was 9 years old, Rundle told her that he loved her because he had loved her father, who was, quote, the best man that ever lived. Similarly, Thomas Secker wrote to her when she was 12. I have many reasons on account of other persons, one of whom you never knew, and some on your own account to love and wish you well. Benson, Butler, and Rundle did not marry, and Secker had no children of his own, and Talbot became a daughter to them all. George Berkeley also took an interest in her well-being, and his family also joined the Secker-Talbot household for a time. So this amounted to an impressive, if possibly intimidating, configuration of father figures in Catherine Talbot's life. 4 bishops and 1 archbishop, all concerned in loving presences in her life. Her religious guidance became a matter of communal interest and the subject of instructive letters. Rundle urged her to be heavenly minded. When the mind ceases to ascend, he wrote, it descends. Secker wrote her a lengthy letter in 1733 in which he advised her to do good cheerfully and patiently bear evil, thinking with reverence and love of God, who observed her conduct. Toward the letter's end, he wrote, this is a very serious letter, dear Kitty, but seriousness is the foundation of the building of life. He wanted to guide her in laying the foundation of her life, believing that, quote, if the right care be taken first of the real, though invisible support of all, then the work rises by sure degrees, the delight of every beholder. Talbot's early life was thus shaped by multiple parental influences that exhibited highly porous boundaries between familial and religious ties. Talbot and the Seckers were explicit in conceiving of their relationships as intimate and familial. Secker wrote to Talbot as a child of 12, you are the only child of a very good woman, our dear friend, and instead of a child, to my wife and me. The affection we all have for one another is united in you. Talbot expanded this relational language. After Catherine Secker's death in 1748, Talbot wrote a poem of commemoration. Thy memory still forever dear, I, as a parent's, will revere. Talbot and her mother continued to live with Thomas Secker after his wife's death, and Talbot wrote of their family circle on the last day of 1751. My dearest Mama, Eugene, and I live here as happy in one another as can be. Eugene, inexplicably, was Talbot's affectionate name for Thomas Secker. She wrote to a close friend of her gratitude to God for giving her, quote, such a parent in Thomas Secker. And after his death, she remembered him as the tenderest father. He was more than parent and plus que père, that is more than father, to Talbot. The fluid boundaries between friend and sibling can also be seen clearly in Catherine Talbot's social circle. Talbot had no biological siblings, yet circumstance, personal affection, and common intellectual and religious ideals meant that particular friends acted as siblings in her life. The peer who knew Talbot most intimately from her childhood years was Jemima Campbell. From 1733, Thomas Secker was rector of St. James's Piccadilly, and Campbell lived nearby in St. James's Square, both seen in this print. And Campbell's grandfather was the Duke of Kent, and he had established her in a household in St. James's Square after the death of her parents. The Duke's primary residence was at Rest in Bedfordshire. And when separated from his granddaughter, he asked Thomas Secker to look in on her. Secker did watch over her, in letters referring to himself as Campbell's loving guardian. Living within a short walk of each other in St. James's Square, and both cared for by the Seckers, Talbot and Campbell, in 1733, they were aged 12 and 11. They grew up like siblings. When they were separated from each other, they wrote letters, and these letters record the girls' growing affection as well as their shared reading, a practice they later associated with their early bond. Recalling their long relationship in 1751, Talbot expressed gratitude for those who have traveled through life, sometimes in the same path, forming their likeness together. She wrote that her friendship with Campbell unites you and me gently for so many years, in much the same way that a sibling might. Catherine Talbot explicitly employed familial language to denote ties of affection with Campbell and with others. Familial affection was not bound to biological connections. As an adult, while most often she addressed author Elizabeth Carter as "My dear Miss Carter," she also addressed her as Sister Betty. Indeed, this affectionate sisterhood stimulated associated bonds within her wider family, for Carter became a second daughter to Talbot's mother. When Talbot was visiting a friend in November 1753, and her mother was ill in London, she wrote to Carter, "I do think Mamma's daughter Betty ought to take a post-chaise in all haste and come to town to take care of her, as she did so well last April." Also in 1753, Talbot began to refer to her friend George Berkeley, son of Bishop and father figure George Berkeley, as a sibling. And there's a neat symmetry in that, I think. After observing George the Younger's interactions with his sister Julia, Talbot later wrote in her diary, "I almost wanted to ask him to be my brother too." Whether or not she asked him, from then he frequently appears in her diary as "my brother." Likewise, author and blue stocking Elizabeth Montagu laid affectionate claim to Elizabeth Carter's sister Mary, writing to Carter in 1763, "You may show all my letters to our sister Molly. She is a part of ourselves, and I am entirely yours." Friends thus became siblings, knit into fictive families, even as siblings performed the roles of friends. While members of the Steele family developed a strong and strongly interconnected religious and familial lineage, Catherine Talbot's experience of family relationships was very fluid. Her father's death before her birth and her transplantation with her mother into the Secker household created new patterns of intimacy, not based primarily on genetic relationship. As an only child and a single woman, she had no nieces and nephews of her own. Yet she had grown up alongside Jemima Campbell and Mary Gray, who acted as her siblings, and their children came to be especially dear to Talbot. Now, the lines of this family were endlessly complex. They confound standard family tree diagrams and certainly confound the onion model, but let me give it a try. Okay, to start, Jemima and Mary were actually niece and aunt. Though their closeness in age, they were only 3 years apart, and the circumstances of their family caused them to be raised as siblings. Again, alongside Catherine Talbot. You're still with me? Mary Gray died in 1761, and her husband, David Gregory, in 1767, after which their daughter, Jemima, was adopted by Jemima Campbell, now York, so that cousin raised cousin. Jemima York's children, Amabel and Mary Jemima, who were known to Talbot as Belle and Mouse, along with Jemima Gregory, now York, looked to Talbot as a surrogate aunt. Within this aristocratic world, aunts were more flexible family members, likewise performing key roles in guiding the moral and religious development of a younger generation. And I can't resist including this gorgeous painting of Amabel and Mary Jemima, Belle and Mouse, painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds in 1761. Aunts and aunt figures sometimes became mother figures when a child's parent died. We saw this in the case of Anne Steele and her niece Mary. And Talbot performed a similar role in the life of 15-year-old Julia Berkeley when her father, George Berkeley, died suddenly in 1753, at the very moment, as it happened, that his daughter handed him a cup of tea. The bereaved Berkeleys found comfort and shelter in the Secker Talbot household. Talbot was particularly attentive to Julia at this time and grew deeply attached to her, referring to her affectionately as my daughter and my Julia. Julia's mother still lived, but Talbot's flexible and capacious sense of family allowed her to write to Julia of all her mamas and grandmamas who loved and cared for her. While no formal ties united them, Talbot invested herself in the young girl's life, attending with particular care to her religious instruction, nurturing Julia as surrogate aunt and spiritual mother. While the language of kinship was used so richly in 18th century England to designate kin, it was also used in the context of many other social relationships. It would be impossible to cover in this evening's lecture the full scope of the diffused usages of the language of kinship in the period. But it is important nonetheless, at least to note the principle that the language of kinship could be used well beyond the designation of any circles of kin. From the structural point of view, such diffusion is significant. If the onion model often proved unhelpful for understanding the lexical variety and structural complexity of the language of kinship in 18th century England, we now see that it is also unhelpful for disclosing its broad diffusion through other realms of social discourse. Indeed, if we examine usages of kinship terms in early modern sources, we can see that there was hardly a single kinship term in the English language that was used for designating kin alone. The nearer the kinship term, the broader were its applications. Thus, nuclear family terms were used particularly richly, drawing on relational, moral, and symbolic attributes that could be employed in many contexts. Broad terms such as friend and connection could also shade to include both kinship ties and other effective social relationships. The shape of family in the 18th century was marked by inclusion, recognition, plurality, and flexibility. Together, these qualities enfolded more people into families and households, including those frequently marginalized. It would also seem that the nuclear family was less structurally isolated than it has sometimes appeared. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. So what can we take away from all of this? Are there new possibilities for the way we live our lives today? Let me first take a step even further back into the 18th century. The classic biblical instance of inclusivity and flexibility in relationship is found in the book of Ruth, which tells the story of the widow Naomi's decision to return to Judah, her native homeland. After her husband's and then her two sons' deaths, there is little reason to remain in Moab any longer. Ruth, however, a Moabite woman whom one of Naomi's sons had married, refuses to let Naomi return by herself. She flouts the traditional expectations of kinship. Normally, a woman in her situation would have returned to her own family, as Naomi observes, and insists that she belongs with her mother-in-law rather than with her own biological mother. In language strongly reminiscent of marriage vows, Ruth promises Naomi, "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." And then Ruth says to Naomi, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." The story concludes with Ruth unexpectedly finding a Judahite husband and bearing a son, Obed. This denouement is telling because it is the narrator's way of giving Ruth and Naomi's friendship an elevated place in the history of salvation. For Obed, Ruth's son, becomes the grandfather of David. Here, friendship is seen as the means by which the Davidic line is established. In my own life, I have been blessed with close friendships, where friendship ties shade into and overlap with other familiar ties, even familial ties. The early months of my doctoral studies at Oxford were a lonely time as I wrestled with homesickness and culture shock, as my old identities were seemingly stripped away and strange new ones were being applied. I was now a historian apparently, an 18th centuryist, which didn't sound like a word, a Lincolnite for my college, and an Oxonian. I knew no one in Oxford. No one knew the identities I had shed. No one knew that my life had been changed as a student at Regent, the powerful sense of home I felt in Vancouver, or my huge, crazy family. No offense, Mom. But fairly soon, I met a PhD student from New Zealand, whose name is Roshan. In describing his research to the graduate seminar we were both attending, he used the word evangelical. And afterwards, he told me he saw my head pop up. It had been a long time since I'd heard the word. When he pulled Bruce Hindmarsh's book, The Evangelical Conversion Narrative, out of his bag, I knew we were going to be friends. And we became friends quickly, together with his friend Lottie. I think it was that same evening that I met Lottie that she said to me, "We know you've come to Oxford on your own, and that must be hard sometimes. We want to be here for you. If you need to call someone in the middle of the night, please call us." Their sensitivity and kindness in this can still move me to tears. Roshan and Lottie were precious and intentional friends during an intense time in my life. They looked out for me at social events. We celebrated holidays together. We prayed together, and we ate a lot of food together. Lottie is in all ways magnificent, including as a baker and cook. We even went on holiday to Italy together. Oh, glorious warm week in Tuscany. They had their first child in Oxford and asked me to be her godmother. And I well remember standing together over the baptismal font as we made vows to care for sweet Zoe. This was and is enormously meaningful to me. They have since returned to their native New Zealand, and as I have to Canada. But the autumn before last, we reunited in Hawaii for another glorious week of sunshine and deep connection. Zoe is now 6 years old, just last week. Happy birthday, Zoe. And she has a little sister, Esther, and brother, Isaac. I am Auntie Cindy to them all. Once when Roshan hugged me, he said, brother to sister. Our bonds of friendship shade and slip into other bonds. I am Zoe's godmother. She understands herself to be my god baby. Roshan is my brother, Lottie, my sister. And rather than just feeling grateful to be included, I really believe, and they have assured me, that all 6 of our lives are enriched by the bonds that unite us. I've experienced a slippage of closely defined relationship in other ways as well. My excellent niece, Callie, has sometimes referred to me as her second mother. I love this, even when she doesn't always listen to my gentle nudges, my quiet advice. I was in the hospital with her on the day she was born and have had a regular presence in her life these 20 odd years now. I delight in the woman she's become and treasure each of our conversations. Is our relationship now niece, mother, friend? And aunt, of course. Some years later, I was in another hospital room when my nephew Bennett was born. I cut his umbilical cord and held him close as my sister was wheeled away to be attended to after a cesarean. I am knit into his life as he is mine. There are so many possibilities for relationships that are marked by inclusion, recognition, plurality, and flexibility. We have only to imagine them and to be free enough to step into them. But here we are now, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, obliged by law and public medical directives to adhere to the tight boundaries of the nuclear family and household as they draw lines around those with whom it is safe to associate. There are many who are not included in these safe zones, who do not feel sufficiently the very human needs of love and belonging, or even of affection, affective touch. Perhaps this is a moment to reconsider the shape of family and household. COVID-19 will pass. I have to believe that it will. What will we have learned about the possibilities for human connection when we once again walk freely, hug whom we will, without protective masks? Thank you.
Cindy, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, and through such a unique window, through the lives of these really interesting and intertwined families. And I just noticed that not only do they all have the same names, they all have unusual nicknames that you might not necessarily associate with their given name. And so, well, here, I'll share a secret. I have Cindy's script in front of me, so I could look back and forth a little and go, okay, which one was which? But yeah, so that's just a really funny thing. But I think the nice thing about that is the freedom that people feel to apply nicknames to each other when you're growing in intimacy. So I thought that was really interesting and beautiful. So thank you. To our live audience out there, now is the time to send in your questions. I am monitoring for them. So there's lots to think about and many challenges, but I am just going to start by quoting something you said, Cindy, and an opening question that goes along with it. You said that the human heart is large enough to contain more than those relationships our culture tells us are primary. And you use the word capacious. And I just think that that is a gorgeous image of what we can be as the church. And so I would ask you, I think the church can also be, as you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture, a place where people feel the isolation and the lack of a capaciousness. And so I would ask you, what is your advice to the church right now? I mean, within COVID, but even beyond, well beyond COVID, how do we live out that capaciousness in a fresh way? What would you challenge us to?
That is, that's a great question. I think that the church communities that I have found most welcoming and where I have felt most enfolded have been communities that cross generations and are smaller in size, so it's possible to get to know people more intimately. Yeah, but I think that the cross-generational part of it is really important in that oftentimes it seems like there is, you know, a young families group or, you know, a 20s group or, you know, groups for older people. But if you don't fit into one of those groups, that's when loneliness can certainly settle in, and the experience of being that lonely person can make the church feel closed rather than open and inviting. So, for example, when I talked about single women being the largest group of people who are leaving the church today, it seems to me that once you are out of the 20-something, you know, college group and are not married, there's sort of like a no person's land in the middle that can be very uncomfortable. And the church doesn't really know what to do with such people, aside from perhaps solving the problem of their singleness. By perhaps creating programs to get people matched up.
Yeah. One of the questions that come in is related, I think, to what you've said here, which is what are practices that forge fictive kinship today? And I would say, based on what you've just said, that intergenerational reality in the church is really important for that. And I would almost want to challenge older people in the church to take a chance on the middle-aged and the younger. And I think, like, in our sort of youth-obsessed culture, there is this notion with the older generation, well, they don't want to hear from us. But I think what I'm hearing from you is we actually need to hear from each other. And without that, how can we forge these stronger bonds? So I'm curious, though, if you have thought about other practices that can assist in the forging of these sort of fictive kinship relationships today.
Practices. Well, I mean, I have been quite intentional in searching out possibilities for fictive kinship because it doesn't seem to happen as naturally today as it once did in the 18th century. So one thing that I didn't include is that I have a very dear friend who is in her 70s who I consider to be my own second mother, because like she loves and cares for me so much, and like I have sat at her feet, and yeah, and she is certainly a mother figure in my life. So I'm not sure if that's a practice to be like actually intentional in searching out people in your life. Maybe it is, and that might have something to do with hospitality, which can be tricky as the person who might feel lonely, but to be brave enough to invite people into your home in this cross-generational way to build intentional relationships. Yeah.
One of the things, so I have a traditional sort of nuclear family, and I have 2 little kids, and sometimes I'm hesitant to invite people without little kids over because of the behavior of my children. And it's really interesting because I really theologically believe in this capacious hospitality, and I just love that you use that word, and I'll try not to say it like 100 more times in the next 10 minutes. But I love that vision, but it's really interesting how my own barriers around expectations for what my family is like or what my house is like really stand in the way of that. And yet at the same time, I don't think it's fair to say, well, if you're the one feeling lonely, you need to seek out company. It has to be both and, right? And so perhaps the challenge for people, even with neurotic households in the midst of COVID, work from home, children madness, is to say, my capacious heart is here, but so is my laundry. Like
that's a great gift of friendship, to be like that open about it. I would say don't hesitate to invite somebody into the reality of your life. Often when I text Roshan and Lottie in New Zealand and say, do you have time for a Skype? You know, inevitably the answer that comes back is, it's a madhouse here, but yeah, we'd love to, you know, kind of welcome you into it. And I love it because the kids are really funny, and, you know, they come flying back and forth in front of the camera to wave at me and show me things. It's a gift. I love it.
Well, that's a joy to hear. Another connected question that's come in is, what are ways that we can formalize these types of connections? You mentioned that early on, that in history, there are lots of times when there were things akin to marriage vows taken in non-marriage relationships. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about both some of the historical examples that have struck you, and also how you might see a really new, interesting way forward.
Yeah. So back in the medieval period, which was a very long period, but during that time, very often friends would stand on the steps of the church and make vows to each other in terms of being friends for life. And there are numerous examples of friends being buried together.
Wow. Yeah.
Well. Like that was a lifelong relationship. And I think that there are, I think what I worry for in some ways about is there are, that kind of relationship is not recognized today as deep or meaningful as marriage or family. So if, you know, friends live together or are friends for 40 years or something like that, and one of them dies, there's no language for that kind of grief. You know, it's not something that would be spoken about or mourned by others in the same way.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that. My own personal experience is my husband's recently lost his best friend, and maybe it's an odd thing to think about, but I keep wondering, like, you know, he's got a really great benefits package at his work that gives bereavement leave, but then you think, does that apply to a friend? And what if this friend was closer than any blood relation? And how do our policies impact our definitions? And don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful for the social safety networks that we have in a country like Canada, but how do those impact who we say can be in and who's out? And what if we did take vows on the steps of the church to our friends? What would our policies say about that? So yeah, I think it's really, it's a challenging area to want to collapse something that seems like it's been here for so long. A related question that came in was actually, do you think that in the West, for example, where we have sort of higher financial status, more creature comforts, if you will, that it's actually easier for us to fall into the nuclear family pattern? And have you seen examples, or are there things that you can think of from, you know, countries that have more difficulty in terms of caring for one another, lack of social safety net, etc.? And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little.
Not very confidently, but from what I have heard others say, I think that there is like a more communal and like greater familial kind of just inclusion in some community or some countries that would not be as wealthy as Canada. It's a great question. I wish I could speak more confidently about it.
Yeah, no, I think that is helpful. I think the other connection to that was a question about words that people use in different languages to describe familial relationships. And I know for sure that is really different. And I'm Chinese, though I'm third generation Canadian. There are complicated and complex and many different titles to describe everybody's particular relationship, and that's interesting in and of itself. And what does that mean for responsibility to one another? Another interesting question came in, Cindy. I'm just going to read it to you. It says, you have described to us the capaciousness of the human heart and what possibilities there are for human relationships. Thank you. I am struck by a different narrative with those who use the words family values, which typically describe an intent to isolate and protect the nuclear family from outside influences. In your opinion, is this inimical to fictive friendship and Christian love? And if so, how do we resist that in the church?
Yeah, there is a lot of there is a narrative in the church right now about like protecting the family, family values, sort of an inward turning to make sure that sort of sacred relationship is preserved at all cost. I think that, well, in my experience, I have not seen a threat to the family as some have described it. And I have sometimes, am I coming close to answering that question?
I think so.
What about fictive families in the question?
Yeah, I think the question was, is it inimical to fictive friendship and Christian love to be overly protective of the nuclear family notion? I think it is a tricky question because I think a lot of people take family values to mean different things, but south of the border, there's a distinctiveness that can get a bit messy.
Yeah. I mean, in a word, I would say yes. Probably there is a danger in that. When a nuclear family becomes exclusionary to people in need,
Yeah.
to people who need love, and who have so much to offer to them as well. Like, this is a two-way street, definitely.
Yes.
We have so much to gain from each other. If we think beyond, our own particular experience. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Along those lines, a couple of questions have come in around, have you seen successful fostering and valuing of this larger definition of family and of sacred friendship in the church? So I think that comes from the notion of, like, have there been, I hate to use the word programs, but like programs or ministries or liturgies, or do we need to create those? What exists and what do we need to put our creative energies towards in the church to help?
Mm-hmm. I think, the idea of liturgies is beautiful to me, to recognize just the great variety of life experiences that we all have. I think that in recent years we've made strides in that way. That in my experience anyway, marking Mother's Day and Father's Day have become about more than a biological mother of children and a biological father of children, which I think is really helpful in recognizing the different ways that we can mother and father. Sorry, it's been a long day.
No, sorry. I'm just gonna throw one other small thing out there, and then we'll draw our things to a close. There's a question that came in about the Trinity and how we can look to the relationship of the Trinity as a model for the church. And are there historic examples that you've come across where the Trinity has been the basis for these types of expanded relationships? Or where would you look to in other parts of history?
Christina, did you say you were just going to throw in one other little thing?
Just the Trinity at the end. It's very simple. I'm sorry.
Nothing that's coming to mind right now. What do you think, Christina?
Well, it's interesting. I think about, of course, I'm going to forget, the icon of the Trinity, the rubelet, yes. And I actually have it in one of my desk drawers here, but I'll spare you the rummaging. I always think about that because the looks on their faces are so complex. Like, you can glance at it and think they look bored or sleepy, or you could glance at it and you can think they look really intimate, almost what I would associate with amorous love, or they could look like they have respect for each other. And so I do think if we think about and take an image like that and hold that in front of us and say, well, what are evocative emotions almost that come out of an image of the Trinity, that can give us inspiration for how we might choose to live with each other in ways that go beyond some of the purity culture things, like, oh, you can't come within 2 arms, like you can't be more than 2 meters close to a person of the opposite sex if you're both single. But what does the Trinity actually say about that? And anyways, that's kind of a ramble, but those are some of the thoughts that I had when I was reading that question.
I actually thought of the Rublev icon as well when you read the question. I thought from the perspective of, the person being invited into the community of the Trinity, the altered perspective of the icon. But I imagine I've always thought of it, and maybe I need to rethink this in terms of one person, myself, my individual self, being invited into this larger relationship. But if there are more people on our side of the table, right, being invited into it together, then that's an image that I'd like to think about some more.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful image to perhaps leave us with. And one person wrote in just to comment something very similar, to challenge the older generation to become hosts and grandparents to, and parents to people of all ages in our churches, but also in our neighborhoods. And I just think that we need to challenge ourselves to get out of our fears or expectations or whatnot, and to throw it out there, and let's see who picks it up. And that's who God is calling us to right now.
Yeah.
So
I think we would all be so enriched by those kinds of relationships. So yeah, I mean, yes, older people in the church, like, we need you. And yeah.
well, thank you, Cindy. This has been a really wonderful and challenging, heartwarming, and just super interesting conversation. So thank you so much. I love the work that you're doing, and I deeply appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who sent in questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get all of them or was not able to represent them as perfectly as you have in your writing, but we do appreciate the engagement so much. And we want to thank all of our donors who give to Regent College to make events like this possible. What we always say at our in-person evening public lectures is that coming to a lecture at Regent, which is free, is cheaper than and better than many a movie. So we hope you enjoyed this. We hope you appreciate it. We're grateful to our donor community who give to enable us to do things like this. If you would like to join in the contributions to the work and mission of Regent College through things like evening public lectures, or to provide financial aid for our students, many of whom are in great need because of COVID-19, please do visit our website, rgnt.net/give. Again, that's rgnt.net/give. We love our donors, so come and join us. We're also very excited that there are a number of other lectures coming up still this month, and our next one is a week from now on Monday by Dr. Grace Hui Liang, who's going to be lecturing in Mandarin on reading the Bible in late Qing China. And if you speak Mandarin, or if you know somebody who does, please spread the word and join us right back here on the internet. Thank you for Zoom and good connections. We hope to see you then, or at something else this summer. Thank you again, Cindy. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. God bless you all.